Don, you've written one of the most important commentaries on the Gospel of Matthew, the Word Biblical Commentary, a fine scholarly commentary on Matthew's Gospel. So can we do a kind of brief guide to Matthew's Gospel, beginning with why was Matthew so important to the early church? It was their favourite Gospel, it seems.
Yes, it was. It was certainly the most quoted by the early fathers by far. Mark was neglected entirely because most of Mark, as you know, 90% of Mark is in Matthew already. So the other Gospels don't get the same publicity or public knowledge. Matthew was so popular in the early church, I think primarily because of the way Matthew collected the teachings of Jesus together. And the early church found great resources in those 5 discourses in the Gospel of Matthew. And I think that's probably the main reason why Matthew emerged. Of course, Matthew is itself a comprehensive story of Jesus, has an infancy narrative, and the full story of the ministry of Jesus. So it makes good sense that Matthew would be the most popular. It was also thought to be the earliest gospel, which is another reason, perhaps.
Who wrote it?
My own hypothesis about the authorship of Matthew is that Matthew the Apostle himself collected the sayings of Jesus together into these 5 discourses. So, and I think that apostolic core, that material, is what gives the gospel its name. The Gospel of Matthew as it stands is probably not by Matthew the Apostle, but probably by an apostle, a disciple of Matthew, I should say. The main elements of Matthew, these 5 discourses, go back to Matthew the Apostle himself, whereas the rest is formulated by somebody else who works with the traditional materials available to them, probably somebody associated with Matthew.
So you reject the view of some more skeptical scholars that the name Matthew was just added to give this credibility?
Oh yes, I don't think it's just adding an apostle's name. Why pick that apostle, for example, or against any other apostle? Why not pick Peter or somebody else? There is a reason for the association of these Gospels with the names given to them. As you know, the Gospels themselves are anonymous, as in no author is given in the Gospel itself. But the early church from the beginning identified Matthew with the Apostle Matthew, and I think there's got to be a reason for that, and that's why I'm convinced myself that, I believe myself, that these discourses, which Papias may be referring to when he says that Matthew collected the oracles, the logia, in Aramaic, and each person interpreted them as he was able. I think myself that could well go back to the collection of the sayings of Jesus in Aramaic by Matthew himself and the formation of these major discourses, and then that gives the gospel its name.
When do you think Matthew was written? I mean, dating the Gospels is notoriously difficult, but when do you think the best argument can be made?
Yeah, I know it's very difficult to date these Gospels because I've changed my mind on it. I published an article in the new ISBE, the New Interpreter's Standard Encyclopedia, Bible Encyclopedia, on Matthew, in which I say Matthew was written in the 80s. But when I wrote my commentary, I decided that I was wrong, and I've now come to the conclusion that Matthew is written before 70. And the reason for that is when I was studying the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24.
This is the great eschatological discourse, as it were,
Matthew 24
about
and
the
25.
Destruction of the temple and the end of the world.
Right, mm-hmm. Matthew 24 and 25.
So what did you find there that changed your mind?
Well, in 24:29, when Matthew says immediately after the tribulation of those days, I take the tribulation of those days to be the destruction of Jerusalem. And when Matthew adds the word euthus, immediately, to he's using Mark there, to Mark, that would seem to indicate that he thought that the end would come immediately after the destruction of Jerusalem. But if he's writing 15, 20 years after, 10 or 15 years after the event, he would hardly have added the word immediately to that verse. So I think that suggested to me that Matthew is writing before 70, and I think most of the apostles believed that when Jerusalem was destroyed, that the end would come immediately or virtually immediately afterwards. They couldn't imagine a second destruction of the temple without having the end of the age come upon them. So I changed my dating, and I put Matthew now somewhere in the late 60s, still dependent on Mark, but maybe a year or two after Mark.
So while the Great Jewish War is going on?
Yes, or just prior to it. Perhaps just after the beginning of it, perhaps 68, 69.
This is interesting because one of the main reasons scholars like to date the Gospels, at least the Gospels, except for Mark, post 70, is because they seem to have knowledge of the destruction of Jerusalem. So they just instantly say they have to be after 70. What would your answer be to that?
That's just a failure to believe that somebody can predict the future. I think Jesus predicted the fall of Jerusalem, and that it occurred within that generation, as he says. So that is an element that Jesus was able to speak about with foreknowledge, it seems to me.